I felt that telling the story to a member of law enforcement would only make things worse. I felt like it would end up being a he said, she said battle. He came from a family that had money, could probably get very good lawyers. He might take my past, put it on display, and completely destroy me in a courtroom.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 101. And my guest this week is Lynn Stroud. Lynn found me on LinkedIn and reached out to me to say that she had a survivor story that she would like to share with the SAS audience. It's always an honor to me to have someone contact me because they've heard the podcast and would like to be a guest. Lynn's stories of her sexual assaults, while agonizing to hear, are truly stories that need to be told so that we can normalize the conversation about rape and sexual assault in order to heighten awareness and ultimately reduce the prevalence of rape culture. Lynn is a champion of normalizing the conversation. Her desire is to develop an audience and spread the word of how we can reduce the influence of rape culture in our society. I think you'll be impressed, like I was, by Lynn's strength. Give her a listen, and I'll catch you on the other side. Here's Lynn. Lynn Stroud, thank you for being part of the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you very much for having me on the show and for allowing me to tell my story.
You bet. And for my audience, I'll just give you a quick bit of information. Lynn found me on LinkedIn and became aware of what I do. And Lynn, I'll let you tell the rest of that. What was it that caused you to reach out to me?
I believe in your profile, you're described as a trauma-informed ex-law enforcement officer.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that so interesting. One of the things that I am very hugely in favor of is law enforcement officers and judges and CPS workers and family law attorneys, a lot of people like that they become more educated specifically with dealing with victims of trauma. And I found it so interesting that you had that background because I don't encounter that very often. And I thought that was really incredible.
Well, thank you. And it's true. I don't want to say there's not a lot of trauma-informed law enforcement personnel, but there's not as many as I wish there were. And it is a critical element, I think, of being empathic and compassionate to victims and survivors, especially of interpersonal violence, sexual assault, domestic violence. Are you able to tell us what it is about that interested you in light of what it is that you do?
I've been a paralegal for about 20 years. I've never really worked in criminal law. My career really took me more into, I'd say, more corporate law and compliance and local government and things like that. It's been coming to terms with what happened to me and my own experiences with sexual assault and abusive relationships that has made me realize that there is a need for these trauma-informed and these comprehensive interviews and evaluations coming from these types of people. Because I can tell you from personal experience, trying to speak to a law enforcement officer or trying to speak to anyone about abuse that you've experienced and not getting a good reaction or feeling like you're being dismissed is going to send you in a direction where you're probably not going to seek out any help or any kind of justice. And it's a shame that many people are treated that way.
Wow, Lynn, that is so insightful and really touches on why it is that I wanted to be trauma-informed. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I think I became trauma-informed before the term trauma-informed was a thing. It was just an observation on my part in patrol as I was taking reports from domestic violence and sex assault victims and watching other law enforcement personnel that what you're saying is absolutely true. It's just not that common. And if a victim, if their situation, their experience is not acknowledged in the proper way, if there's not compassion and empathy and a willingness to listen, you're absolutely right. It will shut down a victim or a survivor and stop them from continuing or wanting to be a part of the investigation and possibly the prosecution of their case. And there's recent research even that shows that when victims are minimized or not believed or blamed for their own crime, there are lifetime consequences to that. And what you're saying is absolutely true. It can keep them from telling their experience to anyone else and interfere with their healing process. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that you recognized that in your own situation. That leads us right into what this podcast is all about and why you reached out to me. Lynn, what are you able to tell us about your experience?
My first experience, I wouldn't call this sexual assault, but it was very traumatic for me. And I think that it made a change for me in the way that I felt that I might be believed about having inappropriate behavior geared towards me in the future. And the very first time was when I was 12 years old. I was walking into a park, going to cross-country running practice. I looked over, and coming down the hill from another part of the park were a couple older boys dressed up in football uniforms. And that was, from what I could tell at the time, the high school football team. So these boys were probably a good 3 to 4 years older than I was. And one of the boys yelled out to me and said, "Hey, how old are you?" And I replied, 12. And he said, "Do you put out?" And I didn't quite know what he meant because I was so inexperienced at that age and a little bit sheltered. And it took a minute for it to click. And so I sort of just made this kind of confused and disgusted face at him. And then he and his friends laughed and walked off. I didn't really think too much of it. And a few moments later, down the hill comes a few more football players. And I noticed that my older brother is one of them. So now I'm putting the pieces together that all of these boys are on my brother's football team. And now I'm thinking, is this a friend of his? Is this not a friend of his? Does he even realize that I'm the younger sister of his teammate? And a lot of things are going through my head. And my brother seems very angry. And he marches over to me and says, "What did that kid just say to you?" And I told him, and he looked incredibly angry. And he said, "Okay, I'll take care of it." And he stormed off. And my thinking was, wow, how lucky I am to have a brother who is going to protect me, who's going to stand up for me and not let me be spoken to in that way, especially at such a young age. So later that night, we're setting up for dinner, and my parents are in the adjacent room. And my brother and I are setting the table. And I looked across the table and I said to him, "Hey, did you ever figure out who that boy was?" And he shot me the dirtiest look. And what he was trying to tell me was, keep your mouth shut. We don't talk about those things. We don't talk about what goes on with friends at school here in front of parents. Don't bring it up ever again. And what I learned from that experience was that there was this very odd dichotomy with my brother. And it's something that I've experienced with my father and many men that I've been in relationships with. And that is, they want to be protective, but they also want to be controlling. It's something very strange for a little girl to realize at that age, that kind of prepubescent age. And it set me up to realize that perhaps I couldn't be open about my feelings. And if something inappropriate happened to me, that I had to deal with it on my own. Someone might say, "Oh, that's something so small," but to a child, it's not.
Absolutely not. I think that's a profound realization on your part. I'm so sorry that happened.
So,
it sounds like it was very difficult for you at the time, and I completely relate to that and understand what you're talking about as much as I possibly can from my own experiences and knowing what it feels like to be shut down.
It's unfortunate, but I think the one thing that it has taught me now is that it's my job to stop that generational trauma dead in its tracks and to make sure that it doesn't happen to my own kids.
So important. I'm glad you brought that up because I think there are probably thousands of people in this audience who are hearing this who can absolutely relate to what you're talking about. Lynn,
Right.
in recalling that entire situation, are you able to remember at all what your parents' response was after you asked your brother if he had identified who that person was? Do you remember that?
They didn't hear it.
I see.
And that's why he shot me the look, is that he didn't want them to hear it. He didn't want them involved. And an interesting side note about that boy that had said that to me, several years ago, he actually passed away from a drug overdose, which I certainly wouldn't wish upon anyone. But his experience with me was not his first experience victimizing a girl, because later on in high school, I believe he was either suspended or expelled for inappropriately touching another girl. Clearly, this was an issue for him. This wasn't like a one-time thing where you could maybe brush it off as though it's an immature teenage boy. This was a pattern of behavior.
Wow, which isn't uncommon when we're talking about perpetrator mentality. It usually starts young, and unless it's interrupted in a very strong, impactful way, it's not uncommon for that behavior and that mindset to continue.
Right. So that my second experience with sexual assault, just to fill in a few gaps in the years there, I went from, a very young looking 12-year-old, and then I was sort of a late bloomer. And so I'd say by the time that I turned 15, I was very curvaceous and I looked a lot older than I was. So I went from sort of like looking like a little girl one day to looking maybe like a 20-year-old woman the next day. So I immediately started to attract the attention of older men, which I think was strange for me because it had gone from one extreme to another. By the time I had turned 20, I was in a relationship with an older man. He was 27. The relationship began fairly normally. I think when you first start, you're sort of in that honeymoon phase where you're just so enamored with each other and the things are going well. It was going pretty well. But about 4 months into the relationship, my gynecologist said, you're on the pill, right? And I said, yes. And she said, well, they're coming out with this new product and it's really great for young women like you on the go. And it's a patch. It's a birth control patch that you stick on and you can wear it in the shower and it won't come off. And it's much more convenient because you're only changing it, let's say, once a week, as opposed to remembering to take the pill every single day. And I thought, wow, that's really convenient. I am absolutely on board. That sounds great. So, of course, I put on the first patch and I go on vacation to Aruba and the patch immediately comes off in the ocean. I'm there and my boyfriend at the time was not there. I had gone on vacation with a friend and her family. And I just kept thinking to myself, wow, when I get home, we have to have a very important conversation. And so I eventually came home from my trip and I went to his house and there was this very large barbecue going on. And he was intoxicated. His entire family was like heavily intoxicated. And I pulled him aside and I said, something happened in Aruba. The patch came off. We have to be very, very careful. And he kind of yesed me and was like, okay. Later that evening, we had decided that we weren't going to use a condom, but that he was going to pull out. And he promised me that he would. And so we engage in consensual sex. I'm reminding him every few 30 seconds, a minute, remember, you have to pull out, you have to pull out. And he's like, yeah. And he's getting irritated with me. And then he does not. I immediately said to him, what the hell did you just do? Because I was like, I don't know how much more I could have reminded you. And his response was, I'm sorry, I'm drunk. So at this point, I am freaking out. I have just turned 21 years old. I'm still living with my parents. I haven't completed college yet. I am not on my own health insurance. I'd say a week or two goes by, I don't get my period. I take a pregnancy test and it is positive. And I call him up on the phone and I say, the pregnancy test is positive. I don't know what I'm going to do. And his response is, well, I'm perfectly okay with it. I think we should just get married. I was like, what are you talking about? We've been together for 4 or 5 months. We do not know each other like that. We're not in any way ready for that kind of a step in our relationship. And to just get married for the sake of the child, I really don't think is a good idea. I haven't even gotten my bachelor's degree yet. I have all these things that I have in the works, and I'm not ready to be a mother. I am a 21-year-old kid. Immediately, he goes from trying to convince me to marry him to berating me. You're not a real woman if you don't keep the baby. I don't understand what the issue is. I think many other women who were pregnant in your situation would just be happy that someone wanted to marry them. And I was like, I don't know what decade I am in right now. I don't know who this person is that I am speaking to. I was just worried and stressed out and nervous. I didn't want to tell my parents. I didn't want to tell any of my friends. I was so embarrassed and humiliated. And I kept thinking, this doesn't happen to people like me. The whole experience, what he did, and me now being pregnant, this isn't me. I almost became disassociated. This is something that I would watch in a movie, but I'm not a bad kid. I got good grades in school. I didn't do drugs. I was on the right path. Why am I pregnant right now? I can't believe this. I ended up making an appointment with a Planned Parenthood, and they gave me a second pregnancy test, and they said, you are pregnant. And based on your last period, we think you're about 7 weeks along. And if you don't want to go through with this, you have two options. We can give you the abortion pill. You could take it at home. But a lot of times you can end up in a lot of pain. And sometimes the abortion is not complete with just the pill. So the other option is you could have the D&C and we can send you to a clinic and you can just be done with it. And I opted for the latter option. My boyfriend refused to pay for it. He refused to drive me to the clinic and refused to go with me. It was constant torture. But at the end of the day, I knew what I had to do, and it wasn't an easy decision. It was very emotionally trying. It was very hard for me not to just accept his marriage proposal and just have that child. There was love there already, but I knew that I couldn't be with someone like this. I had a friend of mine drive me to the procedure. I'm grateful that at that time I was able to get it, because I think about what if it had been now and I live in a completely different state, and perhaps I would be stuck with that abusive man. But I did go through with the procedure. And then after that, our relationship took a very definite turn to the negative, to the abusive, I'd say. He was so angry with me for terminating the pregnancy that any love that he may have ever had for me, and I don't think it was real love. I think that it was control. And I think what he did to me was absolutely reproductive coercion in a way. He wanted me pregnant to trap me in a relationship with him. It turned south. He started being very cold to me. He started insulting me. And so eventually we broke up. I think that would have been fine if that was the be all end all. But we spent about maybe 5 months apart. And he called me one day and was very apologetic about his behavior. And I ended up taking him back. And that was the start of a 4 to 5 year period of misery in my life that I couldn't describe, full of psychological torture and narcissistic abuse, coercion and manipulation, and just insidious behavior on his part. It was very sad, and I felt very alone, and I was too scared to tell anyone. And what's sadder is that the people that I did tell acted like it was no big deal because I didn't have any bruises on me. Well, it could be worse. He didn't punch you in the face. And so just buck up. It'll get better, was a lot of the reaction that I got. Mm-hmm. And yet I was too afraid to tell my parents how bad things really were. I don't know why I felt this incredible shame. I just couldn't admit to them that I was with someone and that I kept breaking up and getting back together with someone who treated me so badly. Yeah. There was one situation where it was one point where we were broken up for a few months, and he broke into my house in the middle of the night and walked into my bedroom and scared the heck out of me. The next morning, when I woke up, he had left this very creepy note that, I just wanted to watch you sleep. I really felt like going to the police, maybe getting a protective order. And when I called a friend of mine and told her what had happened and about the note, her response was, well, it really doesn't seem all that awful. I think that the note is kind of sweet. And I really don't think that you should go and file a police report and ruin his whole life over this. Which was terrible.
I'm sitting here in awe of the fact that you were able to maneuver through all of this. Early on, when you started talking about this experience, you said that it was your second experience with sexual assault. Did you recognize at the time that him not fulfilling his promise of pulling out was sexual assault?
I didn't realize it for many years. I don't even think I realized it until recently that I was able to say those words, that I was really able to put it all together. And it's been over 20 years since that happened.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon either. It also sounds like that you had little, if any, emotional support through any of that.
I really didn't. I didn't have a good support circle of friends. I think if I had had just one person say to me, this is wrong, this behavior is wrong, what he did to you was wrong, you need police protection, I think I would have gone to law enforcement.
It also would have probably changed the course of your life in terms of how this has impacted you since that time, because of the things that we were just talking about earlier, about how trauma does impact your life, especially if you're not believed, if you don't have a support system. There is research out there that says if you are supported after a trauma, especially within the first 24 hours, but even within the first 3 months, the long-term impact is so much less if someone is there to support you, to tell you that, yes, you've been wronged. How can I help you? Let me be that support system. Changes a person's long-term response to that. What were your coping mechanisms through all of that?
Whatever they were, I don't even know if I could pinpoint them, but they were not good. I don't even know if I was actually coping. I definitely wasn't processing any of it. And I even got back together with him after that, after he broke into my home, because he always knew how to manipulate me, how to make me feel guilt, how to shame me, how to make me feel small. And I couldn't believe that I was saying those things to myself at the time. But what I was telling myself at this young age was, you're never going to find anyone else who will tolerate you. You have no choice but to get back together with him and make it work.
Such a common response. Lynn, I am so terribly sorry for the experience that you had with that, on top of the experience you went through at 12. And it's probably part and parcel of the experience that you had clear back when you were 12, and your entire viewpoint of yourself and the support system that you were living with a brother who was controlling. I don't know what your parents and your home life situation was like, but it sounds like there was a lot of fear and insecurity about involving them or turning to them for that support system. Would that be correct?
Yes, there was guilt on my part and shame for sure. But I had also grown up with a very controlling father, and he does not have the largest emotional bandwidth. It really all contributes, and it's taken me time to work through that and to complete the circles, kind of relate it all together. Yeah, I think when I begin to tell you more about the next experience with sexual assault and my family's response to it when I told them, I think it's going to make it come full circle for you and the viewers, if that makes sense. Several years later, I did end up finally getting away from that man. It took many years of abuse and finally just me fleeing, me running away from him. But at least I had left him behind and I had relocated to a new state. When I got there, I want to say maybe about a year after I had moved there, I had started dating a man. Once again, this man was older than me, about 7 years. So I was maybe 26 and he was 33, about that. And my thinking was, okay, he seems to really get me. We've spent some time speaking on social media, exchanging messages, and we agreed to finally meet. We seemed to get along really well. We had similar backgrounds in the sense that we had come from similar areas and then moved to the South, and it was sort of culture shock for both of us, and we connected on that level. And once I learned more about him, I learned that he had a job, seemed to come from a good family, and it seemed like all the pieces were fitting together. But very quickly, there were those red flags again. He started to become extremely controlling, jealous, to the point where he would go through my phone and pick out every male name and then ask me who they were and what their relationship was with me. And some of these people were family members. I mean, like you could see clearly that we had the same last name. And yet he was grilling me on who they were. And I was like, that's a cousin. That is a first cousin. What are you so jealous about? But he was threatened by every other man. He was threatened by me giving anyone attention other than him. He isolated me from my friends. He would go back and forth from wanting me to look a certain way so that he could show me off to people like I was some sort of prize or trophy. But at the same time, if I didn't maintain that physical look, I would get insults. So if my weight changed, or if I changed my hair, or if I went out one day and wasn't wearing makeup, it was this constant push and pull of people say you're so much prettier when you have your hair longer and wear makeup, or something, comments like that, just constantly wearing me down and making me feel terrible about myself. I'd say several months into dating, we lived apart, and I was over his house one day and we were being intimate, and we were both naked in his room. And I whispered into his ear and I asked him if he liked what I was doing. I thought that it was romantic. I thought that I was in the moment. Something snapped in him. He got very angry and he grabbed me by both of my shoulders, forced me down, face down into the bed, and held me down by, I'd say, like my upper back neck area, and then pulled the other one of my arms behind my back, almost like what you would do if you were law enforcement arresting someone, where their head is down and their arm is twisted behind them.
Yeah.
So I really couldn't do anything. Then he raped me. It's only been the last couple of years that I've even been able to use that word to describe it, because the first few times I told people what happened, I couldn't say the word rape. I kept saying he proceeded to have sex with me, and then he had sex with me violently or aggressively. Like I couldn't say sexual assault and I couldn't say rape. And once again, I disassociated. I didn't scream no. I didn't scream stop. I didn't scream for help. I just froze.
Yeah. Again, a common trauma response, maybe even to the point of tonic immobility. And that is a common neurobiological trauma response. Again, really sorry that this happened. What I am also struck by is your strength and ability to sit with me here this evening and relate this story. Please continue.
Well, sure. I ended up putting my clothes on very quickly and running out of his house. And he tried to grab me to stop me, but I sort of veered around him. And I ran down the stairs, got in my car, and drove to my house as fast as I could. But as quickly as I had left the house, he had put his clothes on and was right behind me on the road. So the minute I got into my house, he was right there knocking, and I screamed through the door once I looked out and realized it was him. I'm not letting you in. And he said, please let me in. I want to explain. And so eventually I let him in, thinking maybe he would apologize or beg for my forgiveness. And we sat down on the couch and I said to him, you raped me. And he laughed. He laughed at me. He scoffed and said, it wasn't rape. You wanted it. And I was dumbstruck. I couldn't say anything. And I don't remember what the rest of the conversation was like. I think I broke up with him shortly after that, but that relationship also became just very much the same as the one prior. It was me getting fed up with his maltreatment towards me, breaking up with him, and then he would stalk me. He would come to my house uninvited. He would show up at my job. He would call me constantly. He would text me. He would corner my friends in town and try to convince them to get me to take him back. He would go to my family members. It was awful. I felt like I had no escape. But the most disturbing thing is that the day after it happened, I went into work and I worked at a law firm, and I went to the attorney that I worked for and I told her about what had happened. And I think the way that I started talking about it was, something very disturbing happened while I was alone with him. And I told her, and she looked at me like she was so disgusted and disturbed, but she never told me, go immediately to the police department and report it. My thinking at the time was, if a lawyer is not telling me to go immediately to the police station, then maybe no one will believe me. Maybe I don't have much of a claim and I let it go.
Understandably so. There was no support again. I'm so sorry.
Right. Thank you.
Lynn, this whole conversation could lead to so many different questions, but I really want this to be something that you are totally in control of. So if I ask something that you prefer not to answer, please tell me. Are you able to describe what your trauma process was like after that rape? What did your days and nights look like? Or do you even remember? Because you said that one of the things, I guess, that caught my ear was that when he told you it wasn't rape, you wanted it, you don't remember the rest of the conversation, which is typical, again, trauma dissociative type of behavior. You're upset. Are you able to talk to us about that feeling of abuse and trauma and the negativity that you went through for the next several weeks and months, even telling your boss about that? How did that impact you?
For me, it was so much a repeat of the past. It was as if what happened to me was almost being treated as unfortunate, but not a crime. Maybe that he was a less than stellar human being, but that it wasn't rape, maybe, or that it wasn't serious enough. And it circled around in my mind that perhaps I wouldn't be believed because I was in a relationship with him. I began the sexual act consensually. I chose to take my clothes off in his room. I felt that telling the story to a member of law enforcement would only make things worse. I felt like it would end up being a he said, she said battle. He came from a family that had money, could probably get very good lawyers. He might take my past, put it on display, and completely destroy me in a courtroom, or his lawyers might. I don't think I was ready at that point in my life, and I didn't feel safe enough to begin to explore that option. And I never felt supported. Even when I told friends, they definitely thought that it was disturbing, but no one said the words to me, go to the police and file a report. That was rape. No one said those words. And I think because no one else said it, I stopped saying it to myself.
Yeah, of course. Did you have any coping mechanisms after that rape?
I don't even remember. I don't think I did. It was almost like we went on with the relationship and the relationship became so much worse on a different level. It became so much more controlling and physically abusive and verbally abusive. At one point, my finances were so bad that I actually moved into his home. And when I did that, that was the kicker. I mean, he knew he had total control of me at that point because I didn't even have my own home to go back to. I was renting it out so that my finances could recover. So now I was completely under his control.
Yeah.
And every time I tried to leave, he would use my own animals against me. Well, you can't leave. You can't go anywhere. No one will rent you. Maybe you should just leave your dogs here. There was no way I was going to leave my dogs with him. There's no way I would ever leave my dogs ever. They were my best friends. They were my support. I was lucky to have them at the time. There's no way I would have left my animals with that man. Never. And so for fear of everything, I stayed. And I just became this isolated, sad human being. I withdrew.
Help me understand how you were able to get out of that relationship.
I eventually got to a point where I just could no longer take it. People around me were starting to see changes in me. Even my own father, who is usually not the one to notice those things, but he came up to me one day and said, "Is everything all right? You never smile anymore." And it was so hurtful because I kind of felt like, of all people, my father said that to me. This isn't like a trusted friend that I spend a lot of time with. And I started to realize that something was very wrong. Even the more people that I would meet, that I would introduce to him, like when we would start to go to parties and everything, they started to realize that the way he was treating me was very poor. So they started to see the comments in public and when we were in public, which wasn't very often. And so I got an opportunity. The renter who was in my house at the time wanted to leave. I basically said to her, I'll let you out of your lease. Go. And I moved back home. I grabbed the dogs and they were the first thing that I took. And then I think I had a few people come help and pack up a truck. And I finally got away from him. And even after that, he still tried to get me back. He would still show up at my house. He would still speak to my brother on the phone because he and my brother had become quite friendly while I was dating him. He would still go to my friends. It took a while. I think I eventually had to threaten him with a call to the police. I told him that if he didn't leave me alone, that I was going to file a harassment charge or stalking and that he had to go away. And then the real way that I got away from him was I started dating someone else and I left the state. So again, I was the one that had to run, which is sad. It felt like I couldn't get away from these people unless I was the one that took the initiative to relocate myself, which is insane. Why should I have to leave my job and my family? But it's what I had to do.
Can I ask, Lynn, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but was there an element of fear? Help us understand how that fear impacted your daily life of trying to work and trying to have friendships with other people.
I really couldn't.
Yeah.
I could have friends who were girls. I could have friendships with other women. I could not have friends that were male. Under no circumstances, even if it was a situation where I was friends with someone and they were married to a man and I would go over to their house to really mainly hang out with her. But the husband, of course, was there because he lives there as well. Even that became unacceptable because I couldn't be around any other man but him. He wanted me only for himself. He wanted to be my main focus. When we broke up, he tried to use what I call the old carrot in front of the horse trick, which is he said, well, I wanted to marry you and I was just saving up to buy you a nice ring. And I said, don't waste your time. I would never, ever marry you, ever. But I did, because he wouldn't leave me alone for such a long time. I constantly looked over my shoulder every morning that I left for work, every night when I got home, walking the dogs. I didn't know if he was going to randomly stop by my parents' house because they lived in the same town at the time. I didn't know if I was going to randomly go over to my brother's house a few streets away and he would be hanging out there in the living room, like the two of them would be playing video games. And I just really didn't have a life.
Yeah. And fear like that generally takes a toll on people after a while. How did that fear impact what was going on in your life and in the way that you thought about yourself and your predicament? And what did it do to your health?
Oh, it was not good. It was not good. I had opened up to a therapist about what had happened. And unfortunately, he was not a very good therapist. And I don't think I ever told him about the sexual assault, but I had generally told him that I was being treated badly by that man and his family. And he was not incredibly supportive. And so that was not helpful because I just kept looking for reinforcement and acknowledgement from people and I wasn't getting it. And even after I broke up with him, like finally fully broke up with him, it still seemed like there were people around me that would make these comments like, well, he seemed like a nice guy. Maybe you can give it another chance. Or I think he's great. Maybe the problem is you. I really withdrew inwards. I stopped opening up to people. I stopped going out as much. And that fear never really fully left me. Even to this day, I don't live in that state anymore. But my parents still do. And sometimes when I fly back to visit them, there is this fear that maybe I'll arrive with my husband and my children. And what if he's there shooting the shit with my father or hanging out with my older brother? What if I'm driving down the road or I'm having lunch with my family in a restaurant? What if he's there? The fear has never really fully left.
Understandably. Lynn, help us understand how you got to the point where you began that healing process and where you are today, being able to sit here and talk about this.
It has not been an easy one. I found a really, really good therapist about a year ago, and he has helped me work through a lot of this. It's taken a lot of talking, a lot of delving into things that sometimes I'm ashamed and embarrassed to talk about. I'm grateful that I found him. The other part is that I finally, a few months ago, got up the courage to tell my parents and my older brother what happened to me many years ago. The reactions were varied. So I got three different reactions. My mother was very supportive. She was very sympathetic. We talked about it on the phone afterwards because the way I chose to tell them was I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. So I did it with a text message. I wish that maybe I had done it a different way, but that was the only way that I could get it out, was just to write it down and send it before I lost the nerve. So my mother called me and she and I spoke for many hours on the phone, and she was very supportive and she listened to it all. And she said, we can talk about this as many times as you want, as much as you want. And I love you. And I'm sorry that it happened. That was great.
That's so good.
The reaction of my father was to go practically catatonic. My mother said that he didn't really speak for several days. So he had gone into some sort of state of shock. He couldn't really process it. When he and I did finally speak on the phone about a week later, he said that he was sorry that it happened, but it was not very sincere. There was not a lot of emotion behind it. He just sounded almost like a computer just repeating the same thing over and over again. Yeah. I'm sorry that it happened, but I didn't know. I'm sorry that it happened, but I didn't know. And if I had known, I wouldn't have said hi to him when I was walking around town, and I wouldn't have had dinner with his parents. And I was like, I understand, I do. The part where the conversation went very wrong was that after all of that, he said, I have to tell you, he has been very, very good to your brother. I just sat on the other end of the phone. I can't believe you would actually say that to your daughter about her rapist and her abuser. It's so demoralizing. But what I said to him in the end was, I could have gotten into like a knockdown, drag out verbal fight with my dad. Lord knows that's happened before, that I've gone toe to toe with him. It just didn't seem like it was worth it because he's not capable of understanding. That's what I started to realize, is that he's just not capable of really getting it. I told him, I've done too much work on myself and I've come too far and I won't go back. We really don't have very much of a relationship. It's sort of superficial. He speaks to my kids on FaceTime, and he came to visit several months after I told him. It never really came up during the visit. I didn't spend any time alone with him while he was here, but he's very good with my kids, and I don't want to damage that relationship.
Sure.
So I sort of just shrugged my shoulders, and it's almost like the elephant that's in the room that neither one of us is ever going to bring up. Maybe. By far, though, the worst reaction came from my older brother. And what I had not realized when I let this information out was that apparently this man, my ex-boyfriend, and my older brother had maintained much more of a relationship than I thought. I thought that they were more like acquaintances, and it turns out maybe they're more like pretty good friends. I didn't know this when I sent the text. And so the response that I got from my older brother was what can only be described as vitriol word salad. It was just a run-on of hate, of what's wrong with you? Why are you bringing this up now? You're married to a good man. It's 15 years later. You live miles away. Why don't you just let it go? He then referred to the Me Too movement as a bunch of bullshit. It was awful. I couldn't believe that was coming from my own brother's mouth. And at the same time, it's almost like when I really think about it, maybe I could, like looking back to what had happened when I was a kid and when I was a teenager, maybe there was that old teenager popping up again that says that you should just keep this to yourself. Yeah. And we don't talk about these things in our family, and you should just be happy now and let it go. Let it roll off your shoulders. And so my response to him was that I was done conversing with him. The last words that my brother ever spoke to me via text were F you. Wow. And my brother and I have not spoken since.
I'm so sorry. That sounds horrible and difficult to deal with for sure. You mentioned that at some point there were no words to even describe what was going on. Was that you that you were referring to, if I remember right?
Based on the reaction of my brother or my father?
Your father. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. After he said that to me, he said that my rapist had been really good to my brother. I definitely paused. I didn't even know how I was going to respond because part of me wanted to fly into a rage and scream into the phone, "What is wrong with you? Why would you ever say that to anyone,
Mm-hmm.
let alone your own child?" Another part of me was just like I said, it was sort of like, you could scream at all you want. You'll be screaming into the void. The only one who's going to get worked up is you
Yeah.
because he's incapable. He's incapable of understanding.
Yeah. And you mentioned that that bandwidth just wasn't there with him in terms of the emotional response, but it sounds like now that was even really amplified by his realization that this wasn't a minor situation. This was out and out rape. So there's a response there on his part that's, again, not only a lack of emotional understanding, but I think a lack of understanding and education on what the human response to something like that would be. And that's part of being trauma informed, and that I think is not only important for law enforcement. I think it's important for every single person to be as trauma informed as they possibly can be, especially in situations like this that you're describing, where it sounds like your mom was much more informed about how to be supportive, how to listen, how to be empathic and compassionate through that, and say, look, I'm here if you ever need to talk about this some more. I'll listen. I'll be there for you. And that's a huge part of being trauma informed and being understanding and empathic and capable of listening. So I think it's important that you've brought all this up. At the same time, I'm, again, impressed with your strength and your willingness to talk about this, and wonder if that aspect of wanting to be on this show, of understanding that talking about these things is an important part of the healing journey.
It absolutely is.
Tell me more about your thought process about that, of understanding that coming on this show is a process of healing.
Every time I choose to retell these stories, I thought at the beginning that it would make it hurt more, that it would dredge up feelings, that it would be better if I buried in the long run. It is quite the opposite. Every time I choose to open up about my toxic childhood or the abuse, I think that it helps me heal. And I think that's why I needed my family members to know what happened. Their responses, two of them, were very unfortunate, but I don't regret telling them in any way. I feel like I've sort of opened up this part of myself and I want to do it more. So I've realized I've done a few other podcasts and they've been on different subjects. One was specifically about narcissistic abuse and others were about emotional abuse. And so all have been little different aspects of my life. Mm-hmm. But I realize as I get older that what I eventually want to be able to do is to be the most informed advocate that I can be to other people and also to those around me. And so when my children are of age, I don't know if they'll ever hear this. I hope that they do one day when they are ready, but I hope that they realize that parents can be victims, that parents are human. I don't know if I ever really got that about my own parents, that they had these weaknesses, that they had their own trauma from their own childhoods, because it was something that wasn't talked about in former generations. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping to one day be able to get up in front of a large group of people and tell these stories. And I really, really hope that members of law enforcement are there in the audience. I hope that lawyers are there. I hope that advocates are there. I hope that judges are there to listen to all of it, because I have been traumatized not only by the crime, but by the reaction of other people to the crime. And I want people to see the trauma, but I want them to see that that's not all that there is about me, that I can take it and use the pain and hopefully help other people.
Well, Lynn, you're part of a community. You're now part of the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast family, and I welcome you, and I appreciate you, and I hope you feel supported, cared about, if from no other person so far than me, because I think what you're doing is so amazing and so good, and I know other people are relating to what you're saying, and not only those in the victim-survivor categories, but others who are listening to this as far as gaining an education and gaining an approach that may be empathic to someone in their lives who's gone through something like this. I'm appreciative on that level too. What I'm wondering is if you are able to talk to us about your relationship with your current husband and the support that you are getting from him and what his thoughts are about you even being on this show.
My relationship with my current husband is incredibly supportive. I am grateful every single day he is in my life. I'm grateful every single day for both of my children. And I feel very fortunate that my children get to see their mother being treated with respect and with compassion and with love. When we first started dating, it was very hard for me. I had a lot of trust issues to overcome. And there were times where I did push him away. It was almost like I didn't trust my own instincts. But he was patient and he kind of stuck through it. I don't think that I ever experienced intimacy until I started dating my husband, which is a bit sad if you think about it, because I had a whole lifetime of relationships before I met him and such a history of trauma and abuse. But I do feel incredibly lucky that he's in my life, and he is so supportive of me doing this podcast. He's incredibly supportive of me doing advocacy training, of me going to therapy, processing all this. We have the same feeling about our children, and that is that we are both tackling a lot of general trauma, and we're both working so hard to be these type of parents where our children will come to us when something is wrong and that they don't feel like they have to take it on alone. We're trying to raise these compassionate, kind little humans. It's wonderful. I feel incredibly lucky to have him.
I truly am happy for you. Pass on to your husband how commendable I think he is and how amazing and strong he is too. I appreciate his care, concern, and love for you, because I know how important that is to not only a relationship, but to someone who is going through that healing process as a survivor of rape and sexual assault. So congratulations on that. That is so good to hear. I'm thrilled and happy that that's part of your life now. Lynn, when people talk about horrific past experiences of trauma, especially with regard to rape and sexual assault, it isn't uncommon for these explicit memories that you've talked about, memories that you know you have and that you've described to us, to activate implicit memories, memories that are in your head that you maybe weren't even aware of when you started talking about this evening. And those are going to come up. It's just part of the human experience when you're talking about traumatic experiences, that you have some level of re-experiencing of that trauma and those processes that brought you to where you are today, even through the healing that you've fortunately managed to experience also. But I'm wondering, what will you do when this interview is over to take care of Lynn? When those implicit memories and those trauma experiences intrude into your life the rest of this evening, tomorrow, for the next few days, weeks, what will you do to take care of yourself?
It is a mixture of a lot of things. I think that physical activity is very good. I think it's great for my brain, and I also just think it's great for me to get moving. But the one thing that I really like is Pilates. It's something that I try to do a few times a week. It's good physical exercise. It sort of also gives me the time to focus on my breathing. because there's a big aspect in Pilates where you're laying on the reformer, where you're focusing a lot on just your breathing and activating your core. And I think that's really good for me, just getting that breathing exercise. At the same time, I don't think that I could do something maybe as slow as yoga. I think that would be great for other people, but I think yoga is it for me and so meditative that I might get lost in my own thoughts. But I think Pilates is sort of like just fast enough where I'm going from one thing to another and I feel sort of like afterwards I've had a really good workout. And that's one thing. Spending time with my family. I love spending time with my husband and my kids. We do a ton of activities. Sometimes we like relaxing here at home, but we love to go to the zoo, to aquariums, farms. My kids love animals, especially my daughter. And there's this therapeutic aspect of being around animals that's so good for the both of them. Yeah. Like it's like just this gentle energy like comes out of them. Mm-hmm. And it's so great. Now that they're getting a little bit older, we're trying to travel more, take more road trips, go to parts of the country that I've never seen yet. But sometimes it's as simple as decompressing. I really love movies, and I love movies of all different kinds. So sometimes what I'll need to do if it's at nighttime is I just kind of need to delve into a movie and just forget about my own stuff a little bit. And then I'll realize that once I'm back kind of in the room with my therapist, I see him weekly. It's something that I can delve into a little bit more with him. And he's kind of there to kind of help me on the recovery side of it, because he knows that I'm doing these podcasts. And he said something very similar to what you did, where you're doing a few of these and realize that you may need some recovery time for yourself, some mental recovery time. I think it's all of that. There's not, I don't think, one magical thing. It's just a whole bunch of things, and it's caring about each part of my body, the physical, the mental, and the emotional, all of it.
I think that speaks volumes to all of the research that's out there that says that the more coping mechanisms you have, the healthier you are. And you have just mentioned several that are amazingly powerful. Especially, I think one that I relate to is watching movies. Because it does. It kind of takes you out of the world you're in now and puts you into this sometimes imaginary, sometimes realistic, but different world. But also that you have control over, because if it gets to a point that it's too traumatic or where it's kind of reminding you or activating you about things that are painful, you can turn it off or you can fast forward. I think that's a great coping mechanism that you've got. All of the ones that you've mentioned are amazing, especially true about your family and your kids. That's such a powerful aspect of the healing process, and I'm glad you have that. Lynn, what else would you like to leave with the audience before we wrap all of this up?
I'd like to tell anyone out there who has been a victim of any kind of abuse, sexual, emotional, psychological, physical, it is absolutely 100% not your fault. You are never at fault. I do like to do a deep dive into some of the maybe childhood aspects or family aspects of some of the people that I've been in relationships with. And it helps me to understand why they might have ended up the way that they did, but it never excuses their abuse. It is always their choice in the end to abuse. To anyone out there, it is never an easy decision to report something, but I encourage you to surround yourself with positive people and to try to document or report anything that you feel is harmful or inappropriate, because it may end up showing a pattern of behavior on the part of your abuser, and you may be able to get justice one day.
Wow, all of that is so powerful. I think what I would like to add to that is that if you are a victim or survivor of rape or sexual assault and make that decision, as Lynn talked about, of making a police report, it's your right to ask certain questions about who you have to report to, and that it's okay to ask if you could have someone to take your report that is trauma-informed, that does have knowledge and experience about the dynamics of rape and sexual assault, both on the part of the victim and the trauma that victims go through, but also that they are educated on perpetrator mentality and that they're aware of those dynamics. There is nothing wrong with asking for that type of a patrol officer to take your report, or if it's an investigator who's taking your report. If that agency doesn't have someone that is trauma informed, but there's nothing wrong with going to your county sheriff's department, asking those questions there. If that's not a possibility, then go to the state level and ask if the state investigative agency has somebody who's trauma informed, because all three of those jurisdictions have authority over the case where that crime occurred. Yeah, explore that. I think the words that you've expressed here in terms of telling people that it isn't their fault is critically important. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Thank you so much for everything that you've talked about here tonight, Lynn. I'm so grateful for you and your willingness to come on the show.
Thank you very much for allowing me to tell my story. There is a lot more, but I feel like I hit the most pivotal notes.
Thank you, Lynn. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. My heartfelt thanks and appreciation go out to Lynn Stroud, who is on a mission to get her stories of being sexually assaulted and raped out to the world. Her fearless approach and courageous strength are what this podcast is all about. Thank you, Lynn. Keep doing what you're doing. And to those of you in my audience who are spreading the word about this podcast, thank you. And please keep doing what you're doing also. And to further help victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault, we can all start by believing, especially when a victim or survivor is reaching out to tell their story or is seeking support, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Be sure to subscribe and to rate this podcast. Every bit of it helps the podcast grow. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday to hear another guest share their rape or sexual assault story. We'll see you next week.